Okay, we left off in Isaiah. I'm trying to jog my memory a little bit. Did we tie up all the loose ends from chapter 32? I think we did. I think we did too, but I wanted to just double check. Somebody thought there was just something, well, why didn't you cover this? Then, wouldn't want to leave them hanging. In that case, that brings us to Isaiah 33. Again, I just want to remind us of the larger context of this section of Isaiah that we are in. In Isaiah 28 through 35, Judah is being faced with this dilemma of whether or not they're going to trust God or they're going to trust the outside Gentile nations, specifically the nation of Egypt. There was a great temptation at that time to make an alliance with Egypt so that they could, bolster their defenses against the Assyrians. Well, Isaiah comes in and says, first of all, that you got it all wrong. Your problem is the complete bankruptcy of your leadership. The spiritual failure of the people who are ruling your country. They're blind, they're drunkards, they are foolish people, they're honoring me with their lips, but their heart is so far away from me, and they are just honoring me with tradition learned by rote, really. And of course, the false solution, Isaiah denigrates that in chapters 30 and 31 of Egypt. Don't make an alliance with Egypt. That's a bad idea. It will only lead to trouble. They're not going to help you. They're not God. They can't save you. The true solution, which he started in chapter 32, is about a king that will reign righteously. They're going to have a ruler that fills the role of the false leaders in a way that, had never been done before. Now, of course, we kind of already know the punchline, so to speak. But he doesn't come out and say who this king is. He just kind of says a king's going to reign righteously. And he keeps talking about it. And it isn't until the very end of chapter 33 that he finally comes out and says that Yahweh is the king. So, spoiler alert, that's the basic idea of where we're going with this. Now, chapters 32 through 33 break down a little bit like this. We talked about how, the true leaders are going to replace the foolish, bankrupt leadership. And really how bad leadership, bad government has always existed and will always exist until Christ returns and, fixes everything under His rule. All enemies are subjected to His feet. Every knee bows, every tongue confesses, etc. And there's a real need as well for the outpouring of God's Spirit, which is fulfilled in the New Testament times. But now we come to chapter 33, and we see just how helpless the nation really is. Woe to you, O destroyer, while you were not destroyed, and he who was treacherous, while others did not deal treacherously with him. As soon as you finish destroying, you will be destroyed. As soon as you cease to deal treacherously, others will deal treacherously with you. O Lord, be gracious to us. We have waited for you. Be their strength every morning, our salvation also in the time of distress. At the sound of the tumult, peoples flee. At the lifting up of yourself, nations disperse. Your spoil is gathered as the caterpillar gathers. As locusts rushing about, men rush upon it, about on it. The Lord is exalted, for He dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness, and He will be the stability of your times, a wealth of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is His treasure. Behold, their brave men cry in the streets. The ambassadors of peace weep bitterly. The highways are desolate. The traveler has ceased. He has broken the covenant. He has despised the cities. He has no regard for man. The land mourns and pines away. Lebanon is ashamed and withers. Sharon is like a desert plain, and Bashan and Carmel lose their foliage. Now I will arise, says the Lord. Now I will be exalted. Now I will be lifted up. You have conceived chaff. You will give birth to stubble. My breath will consume you like a fire. The peoples will be burned to lime, like cut thorns which are burned in the fire. You who are far away, hear what I have done. And you who are near, acknowledge my might. Sinners in Zion are terrified. Trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can live with the consuming fire? Who among us can live with continual burning? He who walks righteously and speaks with sincerity. He who rejects unjust gain and shakes his hands so that they hold no bribe. He who stops his ears from hearing about bloodshed and shuts his eyes from looking upon evil. He will dwell on the heights. His refuge will be the impregnable rock. His bread will be given him. His water will be sure. All right, now there's several pieces to this passage we just read. It starts out with this kind of this woe to the destroyer. Who is the destroyer in verse 1? Yeah, the Assyrians, and I think that that's probably right in this context. Now, theoretically, any nation that oppresses or opposes God's people, you could call the destroyer. But in this specific context, yes, the Assyrians are the destroyer. And after God is done using them to destroy, He turns around and does what? He destroys them. He destroys the destroyer. And in fact, this is something that we saw back in chapter 10 and verse 12, when he said that, "So it will be that when the Lord has completed all His work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, He will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his haughtiness." Assyria is just a tool in God's hand. And once God is done using that tool, it's time to, get rid of it. I mean, in this case, I don't know very many people that throw their tools away when they're done using them one time, but I guess in this case, they've served their purpose. They're no longer useful. They are to be destroyed here. The destroyer and the betrayer are destroyed and betrayed. This is an example of the law of equal retribution. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And after the destroyer is destroyed, in verses 2 through 6, we see how the Lord dwells in Zion. What happens when God dwells in Zion? What are some of the images that Isaiah uses here?
Well, it says, "Be thou our arm every morning."
Okay.
Our salvation in time of trouble. It's our strong arm, that we can lean on in the morning.
All right.
The idea there, and then the one who saves us, the strong one who can come and rescue us.
Okay. All right. Good. What other kinds of things happen when God dwells in Zion?
Other things?
Yeah. What kind of things does this text talk about? Okay. All right. So there's a kind of a plentifulness that takes place. There's a gathering of a spoil that takes place in verse 4. If you'll notice, the spoil is gathered as the caterpillar. Did anybody's version have something other than caterpillar? I'm just wondering. Mine said caterpillar in verse 4. Yeah, locust is probably better. There's like 5 different words for locusts in the Bible, and they all mean different. I don't know what the differences between them are really, but I guess they just like to talk about locusts a lot because they had that problem, and conversation would get redundant if you use the same word over and over. But it's like a locust gathering, crops, and so the people will gather the spoil. Another thing that comes out in verse 3 is the scattering of the nations, which kind of...
The enemies.
Yeah, the enemies, the scattering of the nations, which, there was a point earlier in Isaiah where he talked about how the Lord's mountain will be exalted and all the nations will flow into it. Does that imagery clash here?
Not at all.
What's the difference? Okay. Right. Yeah, I mean, and, when we're talking about nations, we're probably talking about ultimately Gentile nations as well as the Jewish nation, but
Here you're talking about the enemies of God and of God's people,
Right.
as the nations. Now, when all nations flow into the kingdom of God and into the Zion that God has built, that type of imagery is talking about God's people are going to be drawn from every physical nation of the earth. There's not going to be that national boundary anymore.
Right.
But the scattering of the peoples is significant because you remember the old saying, united we stand, divided we fall. If the enemies of God are scattered, they cannot unite against him.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole theme throughout the Scripture of this, gathering and scattering together. And we got both images true. On the one hand, you got God's exaltation gathers all the nations who will turn to Him and trust Him, while scattering those that would defy His rule. That begs another question too, because what is Israel being told not to do in all of this context?
Go seek help from the nations that are going to be scattered.
Don't seek help from the nations. Here's another reason why. They're going to be scattered. They can't help you. When God dwells in Zion, when God finally takes His seat on His throne, as it were, no one's going to be able to stand. You're either on His side or you are destroyed. God's exaltation, there's this language of being lifted up. At the lifting up of yourself, the nations disperse in verse 3. Verse 5, the Lord is exalted, for He dwells on high. And, you get down to verse 10, God says the same kind of thing. I will arise. This idea of God being lifted up. And it results in justice and righteousness. He fills Zion with justice and righteousness. And really verses 5 and 6 kind of tie the passage together. That God, by being exalted, God defeats the nations and establishes the positive qualities in Zion that have been idealized through Isaiah. It's kind of like what happens with Jesus. God highly exalted Him and bestowed on Him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, those in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now, interestingly, that's also quoting from Isaiah 45, but that kind of language just permeates the Old Testament prophets. This idea of, when God is exalted, everybody has to submit to Him, or they will perish. They have no choice in that. Now, and what we see is that not only is Jerusalem going to have this, defeat of the enemies, but they're going to be a wealthy city. They're going to have a lot of gold in their city? Is that what it's going to be? What's the wealth of Zion?
Justice and righteousness.
Justice, righteousness. What's it say in verse 6?
Ability, abundance of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge.
Wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is His treasure. Interesting, this is not the only place that the fear of the Lord is connected with wisdom in Scripture. Well, we have a Proverbs 1 and verse 7, for instance. Dennis posted something about this on Facebook earlier in the week. When it talks about how a wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. That same slogan appears a lot in the wisdom literature. It's in Job 28. It's in Psalm 111, I think. And I think it's kind of quoted in Ecclesiastes as well. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole purpose of man. This is the whole of man. Now we come to Isaiah. We're coming back to Isaiah 33, though. Isaiah 33, what would you say is the point of verses 7 through 9? Are verses 7 through 9 depicting a happy situation? No, they're not. What's the point? Destroyed? What situation is this describing?
Well, it's describing the circumstance of those that don't put their trust in the Lord.
Yeah.
The fear of Jehovah is thy treasure, and then he starts into, behold, their valiant ones cry without. The enemies of the Lord are the ones that don't put their trust in Him. Doesn't matter if they're strong, doesn't matter if they have superior weaponry or anything of that nature. They're going to fail.
You know. Of course, in some ways, this is a description of the status quo. You know, I mean, the people could be lamenting for help. You know, when are you going to intervene and do this, God? It might be more along those lines, that the people are, you know, for whatever reason, you know, they got all these promises that God has made, and they're dwelling in Zion, and all this terrible stuff's happening. Why is all this terrible stuff happen to us, Lord? You know, we got brave men crying in the streets. We got desolate highways. He has broken the covenant. He has despised the cities. Well, has God broken the covenant? The land mourns and pines away. You know, the idea of the land mourning, the prophet Joel picks that up. I'm going to say Joel picks it up later. I know there's people that think Joel's earlier than this, but I'm not going to get into that right now. You know, he picks it up at some point elsewhere to talk about how the land is mourning over the crisis that has happened to the people in Joel 1 and verse 10. Lebanon is shamed. Sharon is a desert. Bashan and Carmel lose their foliage. It's all terrible. And then what happens in verse 10? Now I will arise. Now I will rise up. And really, here comes the central question, is, well, the fact that God arises prompts some questions in verses 10 through 16. What's the big question that everybody's asking? Or that Isaiah's asking anyway? Who's going to survive this? It's scary when God rises up and acts. You know, He arises, He's exalted, He's lifted up. There's that same kind of lifting up language again. His breath consumes like fire. You know, the word for breath and the word for spirit in Hebrew are the same. He talked about pouring out His Spirit in chapter 32, His ruach, and the Spirit caused fertility and gladness, and everything was joyful. But here He sends His Spirit, His ruach, in another sense, in a consuming fire, so to speak. There's a kind of a tension throughout the Bible on that you know, there's two things in the Old Testament that God pours out. One is His Spirit, which is usually a good thing, and the other is His wrath, which is usually a bad thing for the people it's getting poured out on. It's the same kind of image that John the Immerser is tapping into when he says that there's one coming after me who will immerse in the Holy Spirit and in fire. Well, that's not this one thing. That's two different things. One of which involves you being, you know, gathered up into His barns, and one of which involves being burned up in the unquenchable fire. It's this Spirit and wrath of God tension. Well, here God talks about how, you know, His breath will consume like a fire. The peoples will be burned to lime. And, you know, we've seen this fire theme throughout Isaiah 30 and 31 up to this point, if you remember. In verse 27 of chapter 30, he talked about how burning is His anger, and dense is His smoke. His lips are filled with indignation. His tongue is like a consuming fire. Verse 30, the Lord will cause His voice of authority to be heard, and the descending of His arm to be seen in fierce anger, and in the flame of a consuming fire, in cloudbursts, downpour, and hailstones. In verse 33, for Topeth has long been ready. Indeed, it has been prepared for the king. He has made it deep and large, a pyre of fire with plenty of wood. The breath of the Lord, like a torrent of brimstone, sets it afire. In 31 and verse 9, His rock will pass away because of His panic, and His princes will be terrified at the standard, declares the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. You know, fire has a knack for kind of destroying things that are put into it that are not very durable. So now here's the question. Who's going to survive the consuming fire? Who's going to do that? People who love the Lord, yeah. I mean, it's like you throw metal into the fire, it burns up the impurities, but what's left over is the stuff of any substance. You know, well, you might say that people of substance are going to be the only ones that survive the fire. This questioning and answer kind of sounds a lot like some of the Psalms. Psalm 15, Psalm 24. Who can dwell in the Lord's holy hill? Who can ascend into the mount of the Lord? Who can stand in His holy place? That's not just a question that Isaiah asks. It's really kind of the question of the whole Bible when you think about it. It's man, I mean, because you think about it, when was the first time man tried to dwell with God?
Garden of Eden.
Garden of Eden. Was he able to dwell with God? Nope. No, ultimately, no.
Dwelt with God, but it's also not.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the problem, is that once mankind, violates God, violates the relationship, violates everything, now he can't dwell with God anymore. Evil cannot dwell with a holy God. Talked about that a little bit Sunday, actually. But verses 14 and 15, Isaiah kind of brings up this question again. Who can dwell with the consuming fire? It's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of God. Well, who can live with God? What's the text say? Walks righteously, speaks uprightly.
Despises the gain of oppression.
Okay, unjust gain.
Doesn't take bribes.
No bribery.
Stops his ears from hearing of the shedding of innocent blood.
And that
Refuses to think about looking upon evil.
yeah, that's an interesting one right there. Doesn't want to listen to bloodshed. I mean, I guess some people get excited about that kind of thing, senseless violence and whatnot. But did that show up on there? Oh well. There was a notice that said I had 10% battery left on this thing. Anyhow, well, what we see here is the person who does these things, he's going to dwell on the heights in verse 16. Shakan, which is the same word used for the Lord dwelling on Zion in verse 5. The Hebrews had a special word that they would use to talk about that presence of God that would fill the temple. Whenever the tabernacle was built, this cloud fills the temple and the glory of the Lord fills it. Same thing when you built the temple. They referred to that as the Shekinah. Well, the word, which is just a fancy form of the word for dwelling. And so the person who does these things will dwell where the Lord dwells, in his tabernacle, essentially. And not only that, it says his bread will be given him and his water will be sure. This kind of bread and water, basic provisions. We saw some of this same type of language back in chapter 30 again, where the Lord, verse 20, although the Lord has given you bread of privation and water of oppression, he, your teacher, will no longer hide himself, but your eyes will behold your teacher. Again in verse 23, then he will give you rain for the seed which you sow in the ground, and bread from the yield of the ground, and it will be rich and plenteous on the day your livestock will graze in a roomy pasture. So there you have again that provision of bread and water. That same kind of language is again picked up in the New Testament, is with Jesus talking about himself being the bread of life in John chapter 6, the source of living water in John chapter 7, and so on. That ultimate provision is not found in the stuff you eat and drink at your dinner table. It's found in Jesus Christ. And so that I think is a fuller understanding of what Isaiah is saying here. Any comments or questions up to verse 16? Dennis?
I will arise, now I will lift myself up. What we're supposed to do is lift God up and exalt God. God has to lift himself up and exalt himself and remind us of who he is. It's been one of these things. But by contrast, those that are righteous are brought up to where he is.
That's a good point. It reminded me of something I meant to say and didn't. Well, we've seen this kind of before in Isaiah, but I'll just mention it again because it's been a while since we talked about it. There's this discussion throughout Isaiah of what it means to be lofty and exalted, or being lifted up or exalted. For example, in chapter 2, we saw how the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be abased. It will be against all the cedars of Lebanon that are lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the hills that are lifted up, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. The pride of man will be humbled, and the loftiness of men will be abased, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. Chapter 2 and verses 12 through 17. Which, that's mankind's problem right there, is thinking too highly of himself. He thinks he's more than he is. And Isaiah says, no, only God is exalted. The rest of you all don't have any place putting yourself on the pedestal. That's why in chapter 6, in the year King Uzziah died, Isaiah says, I saw the Lord lofty and exalted, the train of his robe filling the temple. Isaiah 6 and verse 1. And there's another figure that's described as lofty and exalted a little bit later on. Again, translation kind of obscures the fact that these are the same terms in Hebrew. But in 52 and verse 13 of Isaiah, he says, Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were astonished at you, my people, so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Thus he will sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths on account of him. For what had not been told them they will see, and what they had not heard they will understand. Then he goes on. It's the opening to the servant song, which, Isaiah 53 and all that. It's kind of interesting that God's servant, the way he's going to exalt his servant is by sending him through all this oppression and humiliation and destruction. Jesus talks about this in the New Testament as well. John constantly is talking about the moment at which Jesus is glorified. He's using the language of glorified to talk about Jesus' death, which, how's that glorification in any sense of the word? Jesus talks about the Son of Man being lifted up above the earth to draw all men to himself. Well, lifted up how? Is he going to be exalted in any human fashion? Well, no, the great irony of that is he's lifted up on a cross. It's a shameful way to be lifted up. It's an emblem of absolute disfavor. It's the worst possible way to be lifted up, and yet that was what happened. And that's how God ultimately exalted him and bestowed on him that name above every name. So there's really kind of a whole theme, not only throughout Isaiah, but also throughout the whole Bible, again, that gets into that. Exciting stuff. Anything else? All right, verse 17 to the end of the chapter. Your eyes will see the King in his beauty. They will behold a far distant land. Your heart will meditate on terror. Where is he who counts? Where is he who weighs? Where is he who counts the towers? You will no longer see a fierce people, a people of unintelligible speech which no one comprehends, of a stammering tongue which no one understands. Look upon Zion, the city of our appointed feasts. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an undisturbed habitation, a tent which will not be folded. Its stakes will never be pulled up, nor any of its cords be torn apart. But there the majestic one, the Lord, will be for us, a place of rivers and wide canals, on which no boat with oars will go, and on which no mighty ship will pass. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. He will save us. Your tackle hangs slack. It cannot hold the base of its mast firmly, nor spread out the sail. Then the prey of an abundant spoil will be divided. The lame will take the plunder, and no resident will say, I am sick. The people who dwell there will be forgiven their iniquity. Your eyes will see the King. How will we see the King? Judgment is fixing to come. Okay. All right. Doesn't it kind of flow with what goes before?
Yep.
He asked the question, who can dwell with the consuming fire? Well, this person. You will see the King in his beauty. This is the person who's going to see the King. The only way that people will see him is if they are permitted to dwell in Zion. And the only way they're going to dwell in Zion is if they allow their character to be transformed in this fashion. The people will see the King. In verse 19 it says they will not see the stammerers, but in verse 20 it says see Zion, or look upon Zion. It's that same idea there. In verse 18, there's a series of rhetorical questions. Where is he who counts? Where is he who weighs? Where is he who counts the towers? What's that talking about? Where's the counter? The weigher? The tower counter? Who are these people? Why would you be counting towers? Okay, all right. So there's kind of a military tactician thing involved here. And Isaiah asked the question, where are all these people? These are the people that are planning our military strategy. Poof, gone. Why? Huh? Somebody said something. They know it's helpless, okay. Perhaps the
military is not their strength. He's not their salvation.
Right. But more than that, human methods of waging war have been ended. It's part of this overall context of the destruction of human wisdom. When God said that I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside back in chapter 29. Well, it almost sounds a lot like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:20, doesn't it? Where is the scribe? Where is the wise man? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? You see how Paul really kind of not just grabs one or two verses from this passage. He's really kind of incorporating the entirety of this idea in Isaiah into his comments about, look at what God has done through a crucified Christ. It's, God takes everything that you thought was a good idea, a smart idea, and completely turns it on its head and shows how, this is foolishness. It's madness. There's an end to the babbling, no more stammerers. A reversal of the unintelligible speech. Remember back in chapter 28, order on order, line on line, blah, 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 blah. Now, here the babbling conquerors are expelled. Which in one sense, this might be talking about an end to captivity. But another sense refers to it might refer to a breakdown of language barriers themselves. You think about the Spirit being poured out at Pentecost. One of the things that came with that was people being able to understand each other in their own language. There's something to that. And in another sense, there's going to be a real breakdown of all of that when we get to heaven. And language is the thing that divides people. But if God's people are going to be gathered into a single congregation, it seems to necessarily follow that there's going to be some kind of breakdown in language barrier at the end. Verse 20. What's the little paradox we have in verse 20? I thought this was kind of cool. What's verse 20 talking about? Permanent tabernacle, or permanent tent, or whatnot. What's odd about that? Why would you want to? Stakes will never be pulled up. What were tents for? It was portability, right? Here's something that's not portable. It's a tent that's never going to be moved, which is kind of really an oxymoronic figure when you think about it, because tents are designed for portability. Which, you would think that this would also be associated with the wilderness wanderings. Wow. Okay. That one's probably mine too. Okay. Huh?
Shame on you, preacher.
I know, seriously. Trying to raise them right. Really what we have here, actually the word for, in verse 20 for appointed feasts could just generically be meetings. It's the same term used of the tent of meeting in the wilderness that Moses talked about. So look upon Zion, the city of our meetings. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an undisturbed habitation, a tent which will not be folded. So we have the tent of meeting, but we're not going to pick it up and move it to a new location. We're going to leave it where it is, because the wandering is over. Because we've entered the promised land, finally. Now there's hints throughout the Bible that even though Israel got into the promised land and obtained it in Joshua, that they didn't really have the promised land. Because, they're still proverbially wandering in the wilderness. They didn't take all of it. God gave it to them, but they didn't completely possess it. And you have the Hebrew author's statement that, if Joshua had given them rest, there would be no need to speak of another day after that. Just as there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, there remains a promised land for God's people as well. What we see then is that, our promised land is ahead of us. It's in heaven, ultimately. And so the tent is really a city. And, it's just like it's kind of this idea, that God's going to dwell in this tent with His people, and we're not going to have to move around anymore. We're not going to have to wander anymore. We're not going to be going through the situation that the heroes of faith went through in Hebrews 11, where they were all looking for a city. No, there's kind of an end to all of that. Verse 21 talks about God as a river defense. The Lord is a giant place of rivers and wide canals on which no boat can go. And when we talk about boats going on Him, we're not talking about somebody getting in a canoe or a kayak or something. We're talking about warships. There were cities, some of the great cities of the ancient world, like Nineveh and Babylon, were built on top of river systems. But the people don't have that. They don't have the Euphrates and the Tigris. They have God instead. And unlike other rivers, God is not going to allow naval assaults. He's not going to allow a boat or a mighty ship to pass on Him. The city will be unassailable. In verse 22, the Lord is the judge, the lawgiver, and the king. Finally comes out and says who the king is. Now, Isaiah's mentioned the king up to this point in verse 1 of 32 and verse 17 of 33. And he's kind of dropped hints as to who He is. But now He comes out and says it in detail. Yahweh is the king. He's the judge. He's the lawgiver. And the most important part of all of this is the last line of verse 22. He will save us. And then in verse 23, we have kind of an interesting comment here about tackle hanging slack. What's the problem here?
In a sailing ship, no wind for the sails.
Okay.
Nothing to propel the ship.
All right. They're a ship in disarray. They're dead in the water, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's Judah's dilemma. And they can't fix it themselves. But what's the answer to the problem? Okay, yeah. The Lord is the answer. And He provides. What does He do for them? In verses 23 and 24. He forgives them of their iniquities. Skipped right ahead to the answer. Yes, that's correct. You also have, there's going to be so much plunder that even the lame get a share. You're going to have people being healed of their diseases. But the real healing is the forgiveness of sins. Kind of like Jeremiah 31 talks about how, their sins I will remember no more when I make the new covenant with them. It really kind of hints here what Judah's real problem is. Judah's real problem isn't a military problem, and it isn't a political problem, and it isn't some kind of leadership. We just got to get we got to trade out this set of leaders for that set of leaders. Their real problem is spiritual. The real problem is their sins. Until that's addressed, and until that's dealt with, the rest of it, hasn't got a chance. So that's the real problem here. So the choice has been laid out. You can choose Egypt as your trust, or you can choose God as your trust. And chapters 34 and 35, which I hope to cover both of those next time, are going to respectively show the results of choosing one or choosing the other. So that's what I have now on chapter 33. Are there any comments or questions before we close out? We're going to end a little early-ish tonight. That's for all the times I kept you over.